well, what is critical thinking and why should we think critically?
That's a good question.
Don't people do that normally?
So what is critical thinking? There are a lot of definitions of this that you'll find online or in courses or books or wherever. I think the way I would define critical thinking is that it is thinking more than the usual superficial level that we think about things, which is often not very much. I think often in our everyday life, or even when we're learning things, we just kind of naturally we take things kind of at face value. We just sort of, whether we accept them or not, I'm not exactly sure. Some people have the view that we always naturally just accept information that's given to us and only then with effort critique it. I don't know if that's true, but I think naturally we certainly don't think critically about things. We sort of just hear them, maybe agree with them, maybe they pass us over, whatever. And we then go about our day or go about whatever we're doing. Critical thinking is not doing that. Critical thinking is stopping, maybe like literally or just kind of mentally and thinking effortfully about, well, hang on, what's been said here? What's the claim that's been made? Why should I accept this claim? What's the evidence for it? How does it relate to other things that I know or think I know? These sorts of questions. So at a very high level, I think that's all critical thinking is.
Okay. Daniel Kahneman and Tversky and Kahneman wrote a book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Do you want to just describe what the difference between slow is and fast is? Have you heard of the metaphor of the camera? Because we've got a camera here.
The camera? I don't think so.
Well, like the manual mode is more like actually stepping back and considering and taking more time to adjust for exactly the correct settings to get the perfect photo, or the desired photo instead of just automatic mode. And
I haven't heard that analogy before, right?
Yeah.
But maybe I can answer that, well, also answering why we should think critically, because I didn't answer that part of the previous question. Yes. In terms of the, why should we think critically, or what the point of it is. So Daniel Kahneman is a famous psychologist who's done a lot of research on, I guess, different modes of thinking, and one of his books is called Thinking Fast and Slow. And I think that is helpful for thinking about, I guess, kind of different modes of thinking, fast and slow thinking. And kind of what I was saying before, our default mode of thinking is to think fast, which also means fairly superficially about things. Thinking slow is hard and takes effort, and we don't naturally do this very much. And I think one of the challenges, especially in modern life, which is very busy, is to take that time and make the effort to think effortfully and carefully and logically, and therefore slowly, about things. In terms of why this is important, obviously we can't do it about everything that comes up, and that's sometimes a misconception that people have. Or we don't have time to go through the details of every single thing that people say or that we encounter. And that's not the point. The point is to do it appropriately and know when is something that we can just let go, or it's not that important, and when it is something that's important and that we should spend the time on. So the reason why I think critical thinking is so important is because, again, especially in the modern world, which is very complicated, and we have to make many decisions about how we live, we need to make those decisions on the basis of something, and people have all sorts of things that they base their decisions on people's advice that they've heard, books that they've read, things that they see on TV, things that they see on the internet, like culture, tradition, things that to them seem like common sense, or that they just see other people doing, peer pressure. These are all ways that we can kind of consciously or unconsciously make decisions or decide how to behave. There's some validity to all of these as sources of information or sources of influence on us, but there's some idea that there are many factors to consider and many potential sources of information that we would have to draw from. And I think in order to make a good decision or the best decision, critical thinking, thinking slow, thinking deliberately through things is a tool or a set of tools for being able to do that. Often there are things that kind of make sense to us if we don't think about it. If someone just says it, we sort of, oh yeah, that sounds right. But then we think about it a bit more and we realize, well, actually, I don't know what they mean by that, or really, that doesn't actually make sense, or, well, actually, the same person said the opposite thing yesterday, and now that I think about it, I'm not actually sure what they're saying. This is quite common when you stop to think about things. You'll see this all the time, and a good way to practice this is to take things that politicians say, because politicians are great for this. Politicians are very good at saying things that sound right, especially if you kind of are likely to vote for them, or at least might vote for them. It can be different if you're on the opposite side of the political spectrum. But take a politician that you at least don't hate, and then listen to some things that they say in a public context, and sort of see what your initial reaction to them is, and then try to think about what they've actually said and like what are they trying to convey and why might they say that and what reasons might they have for saying that, or what reasons are there for believing them. And a lot of things that they say, when you just ask these basic questions, it turns out that maybe it's unclear what they mean, or maybe it's hard to see that they actually mean anything at all. It's just a thing that people say, or maybe they do mean something very clear, but it's not really clear why you would think that. Or at least there's often many further questions to ask. And so the reason it's important to ask these questions is often if you don't ask these questions, you can end up making quite poor decisions. I mean, a classic example of this is when we're going to make a major purchase, like of a car or a house or something, or even consumer electronics or whatever else, and the salesman might say, oh, it has these great features, it has this memory. If we're talking about a computer, for example, it has a lot of memory, it's a big screen or whatever. But what about the battery life, for example? Well, you didn't think of that because they didn't say it, right? And so if it's not salient, you might have just sort of neglected it and not thought about it. But thinking critically about things is the process of thinking about, well, what are all the good things about it and what are the bad things about it? And then what's important to me and how do I weigh these against each other? And how do I react to what the salesman is saying, knowing that they have an interest in trying to sell it to me, but also they probably do have specialist knowledge. So how to get that knowledge without also taking all of the salesman's spin that they're trying to put on it. And that's essentially the art and practice of critical thinking, is being able to bring together different sources of information, sort through them, and decide how to make sense of them and how to synthesize them in a way that is most suited to my purpose, that helps me make good decisions.
We've recently, can you talk about like the bushfires in Australia, whether that is an indicator of climate change, how much people should take that as evidence for climate change, and whether it can't be taken as evidence for climate change, and maybe gauge some reactions. You mentioned politicians, gauge some political reactions to it.
Climate change is, obviously a big political topic at the moment, and it's a particular example, I think, where we see a lack of critical thinking from not everyone, but a lot of people, and I would say irrespective of their position on it. And I think one of the reasons for this is that it's become such a polarized kind of tribalistic issue where people will take a position on the basis of the people that they know and like and agree with and things that sound good, rather than on the basis of a more in-depth processing. Again, when it comes to fast and slow, most people think quickly about climate change in the sense that, well, they know that this is the view that their side has, and often they'll have sound bites that go with that sound plausible to them, and often can sound plausible to a lot of people. I mean, like, for example, we have to look after the planet for our descendants. I mean, that sounds reasonable, right? I mean, I think it is reasonable, but then you also have to ask further questions about what that means and how we're going to do that and how we weight that against other things we value. On the other hand, some people say, well, we need to have a strong economy, and providing energy for that is essential for a strong economy, for jobs, and for the future. And that sounds good, and I think that there's a lot of truth to that. But of course, then you have to ask the question about, well, what cost does that have? What effect is it having? Are there other ways that we could provide that energy? So the point is that the slogan itself, often they sound good at a superficial level, but then you should, I think, if you're trying to come to an informed view on the matter, a thoughtful view, trying to unpack that. And I think that most people on both sides don't really do that. They just stick with the slogan level, which I think is unfortunate because then you just get people yelling at each other. So in Australia, recently, from where we're recording this, there's been extremely devastating bushfires. And of course, people on different sides of the political spectrum potentially have different reactions to and responses to these bushfires. Many people who are concerned about climate change have been saying that the bushfires are a consequence of climate change and evidence that it's really happening and having strong effects. People who are more skeptical tend to say that, well, we've always had bushfires, and there's this, that, and the other thing that have happened that have made it worse in this particular year, and maybe climate change is contributing, maybe not, but they kind of want to minimize that effect, that contribution. One thing that is, I think, that this illustrates is that people tend to, I think, react very strongly to recent events that are very pertinent. So this often happens when there's like a terrorist attack, or there's a plane crash, or some other very notable event that attracts our attention. There's often a very strong response, and people, I think, draw quite strong conclusions on the basis of it. But often this is not really valid, because when you're thinking critically about something, you have to think, well, how often does this sort of thing happen, and what other things have happened that are similar, and what conclusions can we actually draw from it? So for example, in the case of bushfires, Australia has always had bushfires. They are the worst, I think, now than they have ever been in terms of the land area burnt. The question is, what can we say about whether climate change is contributing to that? The answer is that, as far as I understand, though this is not my area of expertise, that it's very difficult to draw specific connections between a specific event like bushfires, or for that matter, like a hurricane or something else, and climate change, because climate change is something that's measured over, at the very least, decades to centuries. And we can say things on a statistical basis that, like, well, we would expect more hurricanes potentially, although even that can be controversial, but then we might expect a greater number or a higher intensity of hurricanes, or a greater intensity of bushfires if, there are higher average temperatures and so forth. But it's very hard to say whether specifically this particular fire or this particular storm is caused by climate change. It doesn't really even make sense if you think about it, because climate is just kind of like an average over weather and other phenomena that happen over a period of time. And if you think of climate as an average of things, it doesn't really make sense that a change in the average causes a specific thing to happen. It's sort of like saying that people have gotten taller than they used to be in the past, and that therefore that increase in the average height causes a specific person that you meet to be tall. It doesn't really make sense. So there's obviously a lot of complexity there, but the basic point that I want to make is that regardless of which sort of side of the political spectrum one is coming from, I think to really make progress with how to understand things like climate change, we need to be able to ask deeper, more thoughtful questions about it. So, for example, not just is the planet going to end because of climate change, or should we just ignore it, which I don't think is a very helpful sort of dichotomy of thinking about it, but what specific things could we do that would have a meaningful impact on climate change, whilst also minimizing the cost to our economies and employment and things like that. I think that's a sensible discussion to have, and there's a lot of questions to ask around that. I don't think there are easy answers. But I think if people thought a bit more thoughtfully about it, then we would be perhaps having more of that discussion and less of the yelling at each other from the extremes. And I think that we'd be better off as a result.
How do we resolve disagreements, and why we disagree, and where it's good to disagree and where it's not? Okay, so dealing with disagreement.
So disagreement is a pervasive phenomenon in life, and it's one that I don't think people think very much about, despite how common it is. And by disagreement, I'm talking about the fact that whenever we consider questions like in politics or religion or ethics or other things, even if we have a thought out opinion on something that's based on reading that we've done and reflection and so on, even then, you can always find someone who's spent equally as much time and thought about it carefully, and who's equally as intelligent and honest as far as you can tell and so forth, who thinks differently, who has a different opinion that's contradictory to yours. And this, I think, presents us with a problem because, well, again, if you really think that that person is roughly as thoughtful and intelligent and so on as you, then why should you prefer your opinion over theirs? At least in my view, it's not so obvious that we can just assume that we're right just because kind of it's our opinion. I think that when we encounter that sort of disagreement, again, thoughtful disagreement, not just people who've come up with opinions from wherever, but people who thought about it carefully, when we do encounter that, we should reduce our confidence. We should become less convinced that we are in fact that we have the correct opinion. That being said, I don't think that we should just sort of give up our views. I think that we need to engage with the disagreement seriously, because we've got one perspective and different people have other perspectives, and in order to sort of work out who's correct, assuming that they can't all be correct, and maybe it's a synthesis, but whatever the case is, to work that out, we have to engage seriously with people with different views and work through the issues in a thoughtful way. But then a question arises, well, how do we actually do that in practice? Because, as probably viewers appreciate, it's not easy to have these sorts of discussions. If you've ever engaged in a discussion about religion or politics or ethics or whatever else, they can often become quite heated and people talk past each other, and it can often feel like you haven't really gotten anywhere, and people get quite frustrated. And I think this is a shame, but I also think that one of the big reasons for this is because really we don't teach people how to have these sorts of discussions. It's not, maybe we do a little bit of it in school, but I don't think it's done very well. And it's just not something we focus on a lot. Often we focus a lot more on persuading people why we're right than on engaging carefully with someone else's idea. Being able to persuade people is important, but I think that there's another skill set about engaging seriously with people who disagree. So in terms of some things that I think are useful in being able to do this, one of them, I think one of the most important, is being able to try to understand someone else's perspective or view on something. Now that doesn't mean agreeing with it. In fact, you may still vehemently disagree, but it means, well, being able to understand it. And one way you can test whether you understand something is being able to take someone's view and rephrase it in your own words, especially if you can give some reasons and justifications for it. Rephrase it in your own words, obviously not just parroting what they've said, and have them accept that as a legitimate and truthful, accurate representation of what they believe. That might seem like a pretty basic thing, but it's surprisingly difficult for a lot of people to do, because we think we know what other people think, but it turns out that often we have simplified straw man versions of their arguments in our heads, that when we say them, we say them in a way that prejudices anyone who hears what we've said against that view, because of course that's the way we like to present views that we disagree with. We present them in a weak way that makes it seem obviously wrong. There's even specific words or phrases that some people use in doing this, and one to look out for is when people say magically. They say, oh, and then this magically happens or something like that. Almost always, unless you're specifically talking about magic for some reason, people don't think that things happen magically. They think that things happen for a reason. And so if someone's saying that something happens magically, it's probably because they're straw manning or they're presenting a weak version of what someone thinks. There's usually a reason there. Of course, you might be able to critique them and say, well, how does this connection work? But just sort of saying that, oh, they think it's magic is obviously almost certainly not what they think. But anyway, so you'll want to watch for those sorts of things and make sure that you can articulate accurately what other people think. And to be able to do that involves understanding what they think and having an idea of what it's like kind of to live in their head, so to speak, at least with respect to that view, how it makes sense to them. I think it's easy to just dismiss other views and say, well, that doesn't make any sense at all. How could that possibly be true? If that's the level we're at, then I don't think that we're going to be able to engage in a reasoned, thoughtful discussion about it. I think we need to get to the position where we say, okay, I can kind of see how that makes sense, or how that makes sense, or how that would make sense if I believed, X, Y, and Z. That, again, we don't have to believe it to get to that position, but it's at least arriving at a level of understanding or seeing how someone else could believe it. And I think that a lot of people don't reach that position because it takes work and effort to reach that position. Often when we just see something superficially or hear a view and say, oh, that's just rubbish, and we don't take the effort to think about it or think about, okay, how could someone believe that? How could someone honestly and thoughtfully believe that? And this is something I try to do a lot when I hear something that seems obviously wrong or just silly, especially if someone's presenting it as such, like someone says, oh, look at what this other person said, it's just obviously ridiculous. I take a step back and think, okay, well, is there a way that I could believe what was being said here or something like that in a way that's not obviously ridiculous? Even if I still ultimately thought it was wrong, is there a way that you could think that without it being obviously ridiculous or stupid? And often you can do that, and it's something that just takes a bit of effort. Only when you get to that stage, I think, can you then have a serious, thoughtful discussion about, okay, so what are the merits of the arguments for and against a position? Why do we disagree? So trying to get at the root of the disagreement, and there may be multiple of them. I think one place where discussions often go wrong is people get distracted. A classic example of when this happens is when people use an example. They say, okay, here's what I think, and then they'll give an example of that, and then people say, and they'll nitpick the example, and I don't know, but what about this, or a counterexample, and then they just spend the next hour talking about the example. And this is why I actually try to use examples less than I used to, is because people get so easily distracted by an example. And I think the reason for this is because they're not really thinking about the argument, they're just trying to nitpick or disagree with whatever the person said. I think, that's not to say that, sometimes we do have bad examples for things, but the point is, an example is just an example. It's supposed to illustrate the point. It's not supposed to be the point. So we should be, I think, more charitable when people are presenting examples. Sometimes if we think it's a really bad example, try to come up with a better one for them. And so then you can focus on the discussion. Or just accept their example, even if you don't quite agree with it. Just go, okay, I get where they're coming from with this. Let's just accept the example. And then so we can focus on the really important point and not get distracted by things that don't matter. Another thing where people can get distracted is by choice of words. Often will come from different perspectives where we find it appropriate to use particular words. Often if there's moral issue at the basis of the disagreement, this will be relevant, where we might want to describe something as heinous and they just might want to say it's not great, or it's not good but it's not and different words have different shades of meaning that some people might be comfortable with and others not, and you can just spend forever debating about it. And sometimes that's important, but often it's not. Often the word choice is just how we're expressing something, and the core of the disagreement is deeper than that. So I think it can be useful to just allow people to use their own words to describe something. Sometimes we might want to ask clarifying questions. When you use this word, what do you mean? But if we can just accept the way they framed it and try to get to the root of what they're trying to say and then work from there. In terms of another way that discussions can go wrong, relates to word choice as well, but in a somewhat different respect, that people can use words in different ways, have different understandings of what it means. So free will is a classic example of this, that some people mean a free will that's sort of outside of cause and effect, and some people don't mean that, and so people can get confused. Or moral responsibility, some people have different ideas about what that means, and there's a whole host of examples of this from philosophy and politics. Liberalism is a classic one that means different things to different people in the political space. So there's lots of words like that, which when people use them, it's very good to ask, when you say that, what do you mean? And not just assume that they mean what you mean by it. Because often what happens is they'll say something, you impute your meaning of those words, and then what they've said doesn't make any sense, and you can critique them. But actually they're using their meanings for those words, not yours, and so you want to try to understand that. Either understand their meanings, or if you like, you can rephrase it using your words for it, making sure they understand what you mean, and then you can understand what each other means. And okay, so I understand what you've said. Here's how I would say it using my words, and they say, oh, okay, I get it. Yeah, this is what you mean by that term. And then you've understood each other, and you can then actually go about talking about the crux of the disagreement and not just focusing on using different words. So those are some failure modes that I think can happen in these sorts of discussions. But at the end of the day, you do have to approach these discussions with a degree of, I think, humility and willingness to hear views that challenge your own and that are different to your own and so forth. If you don't, then even if you're trying to use these techniques, it's not really going to work. If you're trying to catch someone out, they're going to pick up that, and they're generally not going to react very well, and the discussion could often be quite hostile. And I think of it more as, ideally these discussions should be collaborative. You should be trying to help each other to work out why you disagree and what the basis of it is, and ultimately to work out who's correct, assuming that you have, or if there's a synthesis of your views that's more correct. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, what matters is what is right, not who is right, at least in most cases, I think. And so I think using some of these techniques and trying to be a bit more reflective about how we engage in these discussions can really help. And that's the last point that I want to make on this, is that when I can sense a discussion coming up about a philosophical topic or a political topic or whatever, whether it's a casual conversation or if I've gone to an event or something, you can kind of get the idea that maybe there's a discussion coming up here. Before I just delve into that, I'll think, what do I want to get out of this? Do I feel like just making a few points and then leaving, which maybe sometimes I do, or do I really want to get into a detailed discussion? Do I just want this to be a hostile argument? Usually I don't, but I mean, maybe you might want that sometimes at the pub. Maybe it's just a bit of fun. The point is, there's different reasons for having a discussion, and I think we should just think about that before, even for just a second or two, before engaging in the discussion. What are you trying to get out of this? Because if you want to have a detailed, nuanced, thoughtful discussion, but then you approach it in an aggressive, combative way, well, that's not really going to work. Likewise, if maybe you don't want to have that detailed discussion, but you think that kind of that's what you'll be drawn into or something, well, then just don't engage in the discussion. Maybe it's not the time for it, or it's not the right person. Sometimes someone is just being really hostile and you just think this person's not really receptive to this sort of discussion. So although I'd like to engage in it, they're not really in that position, so I'm just not going to say anything to them. And I've certainly done that before. So before we engage in these discussions or put ourselves in the circumstances where they might happen, thinking about what do I want to get out of this and what type of discussion would I like it to be? And then I think that would actually help a lot in terms of people having negative experiences with these sorts of things, which I think is bad because it can put them off trying to engage in better discussions in the future, which, as I've said, I think is really important.